The UN is celebrating 75 years of its being around the world. What are some of the major achievements that UNHCR has had in this country?
Well, as the UN celebrates 75, I think UNHCR is celebrating 70, which is essentially means that we are more or less at the beginning of the UN. You remember that the first iteration of the UN was the League of Nations. And then, of course, it failed and they created the UN. And immediately after, they have requested Mr. Nansen, I think he was Norwegian, to lead the effort of returning refugees as a result of the World War II, take them back to their countries of origin. That's how we were created. However, and you know that the situation of refugees has never ended. In fact, it started as far back as Jesus Christ. You remember he was a refugee in Egypt, by the way. If all of that to say that in order to talk of achievements, one needs to know where you come from. And to simply say that particularly in Tanzania, which is a country of asylum, despite itself, i.e., whether you want or not, Tanzania will always be a country of asylum. And we had refugees first from Southern Africa. They were fighting for their independence, Mozambique, Angola, South Africa itself, Zimbabwe, and all of that. They have eventually returned, right? And return is already a very big achievement. And then you had 3 waves of Burundian refugees, a group that came in 1972. After 10 years of assistance, they became self-sufficient in the old settlements, Mishamo, Katumba, Uliankulu. That self-sufficiency itself is already an achievement. Refugees were producing and they needed no assistance. When an individual really doesn't need assistance, doesn't need to be fed, it is really an achievement. That's an achievement that has been sustained, they have sustained, and to a point where eventually we also negotiated with the government, and we had agreed with the government to naturalize of those refugees at least 160,000. That's a big achievement that probably not many countries can sing about, but Tanzania can sing about this achievement. It's an achievement for which we really contributed in a major way. And then, of course, you have the other achievement is the return. Actually, very important is the return of refugees to their countries of origin. You're talking, of course, of these Burundians of 1972. I said 160,000 were naturalized, but you also had 52,000 that returned. Not many. Why? Because actually they have stayed here essentially by now 48 years. Now, if you stay 48 years in a country, probably you don't know your roots in your country of origin. But then you also had refugees of 1994. You remember when there was this massacre and genocide in Rwanda with the 2 presidents that died on the plane. That created an influx not just of Burundians, but more importantly of Rwandans. The Rwandans have also returned. It's an achievement. Well, of course, they didn't return in the best of conditions, not necessarily voluntarily, but they did return. It's an achievement. And then you have the Burundians of 2015. Remember the troubles in Burundi 2015. In 2017 was it that we started returning Burundians. And by now we might actually be approaching 90,000 Burundians who have been returning up to today. In fact, today there is a convoy of 800 Burundians who are returning. That's an achievement. However, when you talk of achievement, it's not just in terms of solution. It's actually being able to receive these people when they are fleeing, avoiding that they die, giving them shelter, giving them assistance. It's also an achievement. And in that achievement, we're not working alone. We're working, of course, primarily with the government of Tanzania. And you have in the Ministry of Home Affairs 2 departments that are working with us. There were 3 in the past. It was immigration, but immigration at one point we ended our cooperation because the program had ended, and I think we'll get back to cooperating with immigration. Then there was the Office of the Refugee Department, which is a department that is guardian of the law and policy on refugees in Tanzania. And we cooperate also with the Office of the Inspector General of Police. Why? Because actually, you know that bringing or receiving hundreds of thousands of refugees in a rural environment, that's a huge number. And that huge number brings with it a lot of social problems that need to be managed. So we had to reinforce the police contingent around those refugee camps. All of those aspects of assistance are actually achievements. And I'm thinking achievements of UNHCR, but UNHCR cannot have those achievements working alone. It's particularly the support of the regional authorities, the regional commissioner today in Kigoma, the support of the World Food Program. You know that food for refugees is fully provided by the World Food Program, and the support of other UN agencies such as UNICEF on education and child care. The World Health Organization is also working with us. We are working with IOM in particular on this issue of repatriation. So I could talk of many achievements, but let me say these are the most important.
You mentioned your relationship with, you mentioned that you're working closely with some government departments, and I'd like to describe the partnership, the nature of the partnership, and how this has impacted on the lives of refugees. You might have that relationship with the answer, but how is it? If you could just describe.
Well, our main responsibility is actually about international protection, and as I said, finding durable solutions for people who are supposed to wish to return to their own countries. But that takes a long time. So you have programs that, when you have refugees, as I said, of 1972, some of them are still there. You have refugees of 1994, some of them are still there. You have Congolese refugees that have been streaming and they've never really returned to their country, because you know Eastern DRC, how messy that area is. And partnership simply means that you can't do it alone. Why can't we do it alone? Because when you're providing assistance, it is a multifaceted assistance. People who are staying in asylum for 10 years, they have children that need education. They have health needs. They have all these needs that for which we are not experts. And therefore, we look for expertise, particularly in organizations that are much faster than UNHCR or than any UN organization. These are the NGOs, and we look for NGOs that are specialized in specific areas: education, health, water, sanitation, shelter, managing a camp, all of that. And then, of course, partnership is not just the skills, it's also resources. They also bring quite a lot of resources. Look at WFP probably provides more resources to refugees than does UNHCR. Because feeding, today we are what, at 240,000 refugees in camps. Now, feeding 240,000 refugees every day for all these years, it's really huge. And that is a partnership that we really appreciate very much. Now, the most important partnership is the country that provides the land for the people to stay, the space for the people to stay, and the security for the people to stay. As I said, we do support security, but that is not all that the government is doing. It's doing much more. So the government for us is an important partner. For the time being, our main partner in government is the Ministry of Home Affairs. But frankly, looking at how management refugees should be optimized, I think we should partner with many more government ministries than just the Ministry of Home Affairs. I mean, education, health, we're talking of public health issues, etc. You have ministries that are specialized in their area of competence. So we can have much more partnership than that. But lately we also have realized that just looking at governments and NGOs is not enough. We need to involve everybody that thinks they have a contribution to make to these refugee situations. And here it's very simple. But when you are in a country, for instance, like Nigeria, where not only do you have refugees, but actually more importantly, you have 2 million internally displaced populations, then actually the NGOs are not enough. So what do? We are trying to bring everybody who is interested, the whole of society that is interested in these populations, to be involved to respond to the urgent needs of populations in displacement.
Thank you. And what are some of the main challenges that are facing refugees? And what is UNHCR and other partners implementing to address these challenges? And if you could also please touch on the, I know maybe you wouldn't go so much into the political arena, but you could also look at issues where maybe a certain leader pronounces there's no longer going to be naturalization, or refugees must go home, and maybe not necessarily on a voluntary basis. I think when you're touching on the challenges, you could also highlight on some of these issues that are coming up.
Yes. When you say challenges, that's a huge area of discussion, because well, but let me start with the simplest challenge, is that you know that when there is an emergency situation, most probably the media will capture it and people focus on that emergency, and then you get a lot of support at the beginning. But it's like everything. After some time, there is something else going on somewhere else new, and people focus on that new thing and they forget this one because, well, they have reported about it and it's no longer new. Look at 2015 refugees. In 2015, it was news because you had all these 200,000 refugees coming from Burundi into Tanzania. So everybody paid attention to that. 2016, they still paid attention, but then in 2016, you had issues happening in Cameroon, you had issues happening somewhere else, etc. So you start seeing that that funding that you had in 2015 and 2016, then in 2017, it starts reducing, and it continues reducing because, well, it is now a protracted situation. And one of the problems, the challenges that we have in refugee situations is precisely the protracted nature of these refugee situations. You have refugee situations that go on and on and on. You have heard about Dadaab. Dadaab, when I was employed in this organization 32 years ago, Dadaab existed already, and today is still there. this protractedness is a major challenge. And why is it a challenge? It's a challenge not just in terms of the resources that you can mobilize. Year after year, the resources are reducing. But also it's a challenge because if then a refugee is in a camp, mind you, is not in a village, is not in a free environment, is in a camp, like the way you put animals and control them there, stay there. Meaning then, of course, they depend very much on assistance. And when people depend on assistance year after year after year, even their mentality is a mentality of assistance. So you would have, and in Chad, for instance, if refugees don't hear the car of an NGO making noise by 9 o'clock, they start worrying. Assistance is not coming today. That human mentality is really very, very poor, and it's pitiful. It's pitiful. That's one major challenge. And therefore, the idea that refugees and population should be in a camp is really something that one needs to think about. Of course, each country has their own problems and their own priorities too. So it's a challenge. I was asking the other day, why can't we go to the settlement idea that existed before? And the authorities simply looked at me and said, where? That's a challenge. That's a real challenge. The other challenge, and as I said, is the whole return, and a return as a durable solution. Look at DRC. The DRC situation, and I worked in DRC, I can't remember when, it must be more than 10 years ago. And already at that time, Eastern DRC was producing refugees into Tanzania, into Burundi, into Rwanda and Uganda. And they continue producing. That's also a challenge. It's a challenge in what sense? In the sense that you can't have a durable solution unless the political issues are resolved. And that is really not an area of UNHCR, meaning that we are here only dealing with the consequences, but we can't deal with the root causes, which belong to other branches of the UN system, and also belong to governments that need to be serious about dealing with root causes. Then you have the quality of assistance, which is essentially linked to the funding. That's also a challenge. If assistance is not, if funding is not coming as good as it was at the beginning, then you start compromising on shelter, compromising on education, and all of that. More recently, one challenge for us was COVID. COVID-19 was a challenge, and it really shook us, because you have, in one camp, you have 32,000 refugees. In another camp, you have 70,000 refugees. In another camp, you have 117,000 refugees. And this is a camp, and this is a rural environment. How are you going to control COVID? Because if you don't, then you have 100,000 people in a rural environment where a village normally is no more than maybe 300-500 people. If then there is a public issue such as COVID, such as Ebola in the past, or others, or whatever transmissible disease, how fast that disease can run into the camp and then affect the local population. So we were really rushing, and we managed to get some funding to have preventive activities very, very rapidly. It took us some time. Also, even the refugees did produce face masks. We provided the resources for that. But it was challenging in the sense that what if you had one issue? And then, of course, we continued repatriating the Burundian refugees in that environment. you are transporting populations across borders in a situation of a pandemic where borders are being closed to prevent pandemic. But we had to continue because really it was a little bit of a political issue between the two countries, and UNHCR had to support the voluntary repatriation of refugees. And then, of course, as you say, there are the political issues. Listen, the government has told us that they're tired of refugees. And when you remember, I was saying we had 3 waves of Burundian refugees. There were 2 waves of Rwandan refugees. And the refugees from DRC keep coming. And then you had the refugees from Southern Africa, as I said in the past. Now you have Mozambicans knocking at the door. And I understand that maintaining security, this is a country that prides itself for peace and security. And therefore, they are investing a lot of money on security. And so I understand that they are tired of refugees because really it means that they have to deviate resources to security that could be used for other things. That's a natural reaction. However, these are neighbors that are going nowhere. And these are countries that normally do have conflicts. And Tanzania, because of the way in which Nyerere, the founder of this country, actually put Tanzania in the center of protection of refugees, today, whether you are tired or not, you're going to have refugees. That is not even a political will. It will just happen because your neighbors have those problems. Of course, as I told actually the Minister of Home Affairs at one point, who were a little bit, he was saying, but we need to see these people go. I said, yes, and we will see them go. However, remember you are in a region where you have conflicts from time to time. The Eastern DRC, the relations between Rwanda and Burundi. And unless you look at that and you already foresee that these relations, if they continue like this, they will end up in a conflict and therefore in the exportation of populations to other countries, then wait for more refugees in another few years. What do? The governments have the capacity and the diplomatic skills, and Tanzania has shown that they have the diplomatic skills. You remember late President Mkapa and all of that. They have the diplomatic skills to actually engage in preventive diplomacy. And I think that is something that can be done. That they should be tired of refugees, but that's natural. Everybody would, I mean, even if it were me, if I'm actually using a lot of resources instead of developing my population, I have to provide security, etc., etc. The environment is another major challenge. As I said, you're putting people in a place and you're not thinking of the environment. Why the villages are small? Because by nature, human beings know how to live with the environment. And therefore, you will never have villages that are huge, etc., if there is no firewood around. But then, it is in that environment you go and put a camp of 100,000 people. Well, you have a problem with the environment. So this is another challenge, and they do expect, of course, UNHCR to participate in mitigating the negative impact of the presence of refugees on the environment, and we do. But our resources are humanitarian. These are not developmental resources, so there will never be enough. We will be always pushed, and we will never respond in a manner that satisfies. These are so many of the challenges that we do have.
You mentioned a number of in the part where you're saying, the reaction of government towards refugees, and I'm just wondering, are there any benefits for hosting refugees? And also, if you could reflect on about 2-3 years ago, there was a project that was started by UNHCR in Tanzania where they were providing funds to some refugees in the camps to participate in agricultural activities, and they would sell the vegetables to the local community. I wonder how this project developed, if it's still there. Maybe there are two questions in one, but first, if you could highlight if there are any benefits for hosting refugees. You mentioned the downside, but is there an upside?
The benefits are incidental. In the way we are managing refugees today, and it's not just in Tanzania, in almost every country in Africa, where they are worried about their own security and the arrival of hundreds of thousands of people. You've seen how Europe has reacted to the arrival of Syrians. Probably the only 2 or 3 countries that really received the hundreds of thousands and maybe even millions of Syrians is Turkey, because it's at the door to Europe. And Turkey has used that actually to try and see whether they can extract benefits from the European Union, but that's a political way of extracting benefits. And Germany, because they have an aging population and they need manpower, and that's why they really open the doors for refugees. In Tanzania, as I said, the benefits of the presence of refugees are incidental and not by design. They were by design when Nyerere created settlements and allowed refugees to actually produce a lot of agricultural produce. And even Tabora, the old settlements, they are producing more in the settlements than the rest of the region. That is by design, and therefore they were selling, and I think up to today they are selling tobacco, they are selling all sorts of produce. Today in the camps, if there is any benefit, as I said, it's not by design, but because you have human beings that are inventive. But even when they are inventive, some business have been closed by the government. They simply said, no, we don't want refugees to feel comfortable. So these huge markets that existed, exchange of goods between local population and the refugees, no longer there. The infrastructure there, it's still visible, but it's clear that they do not want to make them feel comfortable. That clearly has been said. But they still have some benefits. But for instance, the World Food Program has a program of promoting cooperatives of local populations, Tanzanians, that are producing beans for the refugees. And I understand, was it last year? Yes, I understand last year the production was really very, very good. And those cooperatives, therefore, can sell. They already have a market for their beans, and that gives them an assured income. I understand it. It was as much as 300 metric tons of beans that were produced by the local population. You can imagine the amount of money they got. Other benefits accrue in 2 ways. One is the access of local populations to the services in the camps. As I said, it's unfortunate that the camps are really closed, because that kind of benefit should have been done differently. In what manner? Instead of us focusing and investing on a clinic in the camp, we should actually have gone to improve the existing clinic in the district. Why? Because that clinic is gazetted. And because it is gazetted, it's already within certain regulations of the Ministry of Health. All you need is to improve that one, which then would give benefits to others. So maybe 10% of the beneficiaries or 15% of the beneficiaries of our clinics are Tanzanians, could have been more. So those are the small benefits. And then you have other benefits, which is drawing the attention of donors and other people who have resources to the general social and economic situation of the refugee impacted areas, which allows them to actually, and we have quite a number of NGOs that have come to the Kigoma area, not for the refugees, but rather for the local population, and they have mobilized resources because these are refugee impacted areas. So very indirect benefit. And then the last benefit that I could talk about is the flow of funds into Tanzania. If I may just mention this year, or rather last year we had, for instance, a procurement bill of around $13 million, procuring blankets and all the things that the refugees need. And of this $13 million, 2.1 million was an importation. And the other 10 point some million dollars was actually local procurement, meaning that we actually procuring from suppliers in Tanzania. That's a small benefit, but if you could talk of benefits.
So earlier you spoke about COVID-19 very briefly, but I'm really interested in finding out, was there any refugee who was affected by COVID-19? And how did you respond? You mentioned you placed all the preventive equipment everywhere, but I would just like to know how the emergence of COVID-19 has affected the refugee operations, and if there was any refugee who was affected by the virus, whether incoming or within the camps, and how you're managing now, where the country is saying, we don't have any cases of COVID-19 in Tanzania.
It's let me say that when COVID-19 started, well, as I said at the beginning, we really quite worried, but we did have very solid support from the regional medical officer in Kigoma, who took upon it himself to actually set up systems not just for the population, but for everybody in the territory. Now, when you say everybody in the territory, including foreigners, and I think that was an approach that helped us immensely, because technically then he helped us, and with the regional commissioner's office, they helped us immediately go into the camps and establish measures such as the control of entry and exit, and that control of entry and exit that already exists, but at least with all the necessary preventive equipment around. I mean, washing hands and measuring temperatures. Those are still in place. And then we also use the opportunity to see among refugees the skills they have to produce masks, because we were importing masks, but they were taking time. In the meantime, you need the masks today, and they are still at sea. Maybe they'll come in 2 months' time. So what do? We went into the refugee camps and organized the refugees into groups, and they produced, I think, 100,000 or plus masks, and they distributed.
Are you reaching your targets in Tanzania with regards to the Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development Goals and the issues affecting refugees? And this is in view also of the UN Secretary General campaign on Building Back Better. What is your situation now?
The gender issues in refugee situations are, of course, part of the protection agenda that we do have, because eventually the major issues that we do have are access to services, particularly education, how the resources are managed, particularly when you're distributing assistance, who controls that kind of resources. And you have cultures and societies where naturally the man controls everything and the woman is essentially at the mercy of the man. I worked in Chad, and the man will get the food, sell the food and drink, and here is you have the wife and the children, etc. So what we have tried to do is to make sure that the woman participates in the management of resources. But you have to be careful, because some of these cultures are very entrenched, and it takes a lot of education to get the man to understand that the participation of the woman is not just an issue for show. And therefore, when you create, for instance, refugee leadership in the camps, when you go and elect the leadership for the refugees in the camp, we make sure that the refugees understand the need to include women in refugee leadership positions, so that they can also talk about their own issues. Secondly, it's an issue that is not specifically to refugees, but it's a cultural issue that needs to be taken as a development issue, really. We take it as a humanitarian issue, and we say, okay, 50% of the leaders must be female. It's easy. But then you can be a female leader and in a group of 10 leaders and still don't talk. Why? Because the men dominate the discussion. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And secondly, it's the protection of the girl child, because we have situations where girls, when they go out there either to fetch firewood or to find a way of contributing to the income of the family, these women are being aggressed. These women are being raped. And therefore, it's really not just an issue that should be limited to the camp, but rather a general education of the population. We do have a lot of work that is being done by UNICEF, not just in the camps, but outside the camps. We do have, even the government has quite a lot of programs about women's empowerment and gender sensitivity. But it's work that is going to take very, very, very long. It's a long-term work, and I think when you look at the moment they had a vice president nominee in America, the way they treated her, it's gender sensitivity is everywhere an issue.
Yeah, so I wanted also to ask you if you have any additional issues that you would like the audience to know about refugees. And I think from the other conversations that we had, I had requested to a follow-up question on the project that was started by UNHCR, providing funds and finances instead of providing the home camps, refugees in the camps.
Yeah.
But they were being given
Yeah.
certain amount of money
Cash,
to enable them to do that activity.
Yes, absolutely. Before even I talk of any messaging, and I think it's good to deal with that one. You see, it has also been proved by certain studies that providing cash to people in distress is a better alternative to providing them with material assistance. You give somebody a pot to cook his beans. Well, the man or the woman knows that this type of pot is not for beans, because the beans they stay as they get burnt, etc., etc. So she prefers to actually use her clay pot for beans, and she uses that pot that you bought for other things. That's an expensive item that is not usable for that person. Meaning that instead of giving you a blanket, maybe I give you money and you don't want a blanket, you just want a kanga. And with the rest of the money you can do other things. So it's been in the humanitarian programs in many countries, we have moved very far with the cash approach, i.e. refugees or IDPs or other people, they are just given an amount of money per month, and they know how to manage that money to cover their needs. Maybe their needs are not food, it's more or to buy clothes for the children or to take the children to school, etc., etc. That's something I also tried to do in Nigeria. At one point we reduced the distribution of food. It's an emergency situation. The emergency is gone. Then instead of giving you food, they give you cash and you buy off the food you want. And the food they want, actually condiments, which we don't give, sugar, which we don't give, and we give oil and we give salt and maybe the things that they don't need and they don't eat culturally. Similarly, for any other needs, it has been proved that cash would be the best thing. So we did start that program here so that refugees could then express themselves economically in a different manner and could expand their human capacity. But we have been told that cash shall not be used in Tanzania. So the programs have essentially folded back, so it's not moving.
So do you have any additional messages that you'd like to share with the audience at the end of this?
Well, yes, absolutely. As I was telling you, Jesus Christ was a refugee. He was a refugee in Africa. And that's important to say. Where did he go? To Africa. And therefore, that spirit of human solidarity is an African thing. You know how it is. If you're eating outside there and somebody passes, karibu chakula. Most of the time, the person will simply say, asante, but at least you say, karibu chakula. So that sense of human solidarity is something that we need not get tired of. Why? Because we didn't choose our neighborhood. Yeah? Burundi or Rwanda did not choose to be neighbors to each other. So this is natural. Secondly, the institution of asylum and security go hand in hand, and we understand that there are problems of security that governments need to deal with. But a refugee is a desperate person who ran away. And can be treated more humanly. Of course, nobody should continue to be a refugee forever. That is also inhuman. And therefore, working in terms of solutions and returning people is an important element. But more important than that is actually to prevent conflicts. And that's a political job. It's not for the UN, it's for governments to prevent conflicts. Anybody who thinks that we like to have refugees because that's our job is simply saying that the medical doctor likes the patient because that gives him money. But the patients will always be there. And that's why the doctors are there. So don't blame the doctor for the disease. Similarly, people are blaming UNHCR for wanting to keep their jobs. It's a similar kind of thing. So we can have a better dialogue around refugees. And in other countries, they have not only refugees, but internally displaced populations. Human displacement is going to be part of the way politicians need to manage their territories. Because even just climate change is displacing a lot of populations. So this would be, for me, the few, and of course the involvement of everybody in improving the lot of refugees and in helping find solutions.